it sounded to me like they were doing so much boots on the ground work to really grow their career, but just were missing some really simple back end things. And they're like, man, like I feel like I'm working so hard and I'm just stuck on this treadmill and I'm just running in place. And it's like, yeah, well, you're lacking kind of these really simple systems that you need to put in place.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by IndiePreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to Creative Juice. This is the podcast where we cover growing and monetizing a fan base and building a music career with marketing strategies that are working right now based on what we see every single day inside of our music marketing agency and across our community of thousands of artists and bands. I hope you enjoy and subscribe. This is episode 374, and I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. We're recording this episode in a different studio today. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, in Jonah McLean, aka Duke's studio, his keyboard den, and I'm very, very excited to welcome Jonah back to the post. Jonah is IndiePreneur's Director of Operations, and he's also one of our lead artist consultants at IndieFounder. And I'm very, very excited about today's episode to talk to Jonah and probably bring in some questions that we hear from a lot of indies about music marketing and digital marketing in general. And we want to share some stories from IndieFounder to give you some context on the questions that you might have about music marketing and how it can help you accomplish your goals and what you're trying to do. Jonah, welcome back to the podcast, dude. Thanks for being here and thanks for having me in your studio.
Yeah, dude. Thanks. It's great to be back. It's just turning into a yearly tradition now on your trip out here to Portland, and we get to be surrounded by synths and talk about music marketing. So fun times.
I know. I love it, man. I love it. I wanted to bring this topic to the show today to showcase different types of marketing campaigns and the goals that they might help you solve to answer questions that you might have as an artist, just to give you some examples of kind of what's possible if you really dial in your music marketing. A lot of these come from questions that I just get out in the wild when I'm talking to artists, when I'm answering questions on Instagram, some of the questions that we get in our inbox as well. And I thought that this would be really interesting because you've worked with, man, at this point, like hundreds of artists inside of IndieFounder, consulting them with the team on how to make their marketing better and how to help them grow their fan base and monetize it. But I don't really ever think we've addressed sort of some of the stories that we've seen across IndieFounder with our clients and how they might apply to some of the questions that artists have out there in the wild. So I thought that this would be really interesting to do. And when we were kind of kicking off the topic together and before we started recording here, so much came to light. So I'm really, really excited to kick this off and talk with you today.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. There's definitely no shortage of approaches and things you can do. And I think one of the coolest things about IndiePreneur and what we teach, and especially like in IndieFounder, I always tell people when we do our consults, like there's no one size fits all. There's no curriculum for this stuff. Like there's things that we know and things we don't, and it's always about kind of trying to find what works for each individual artist and what they got going on. So yeah, it's an exciting topic to kind of crack into and discover more about that stuff.
Dude, that's such a helpful starting point. Like it's so true. There isn't any one size fits all or a perfect box that you can put any artist into. And that's exactly the thought process that really came to my mind when we were brainstorming what to talk about here today. And so I kind of just wanted to have a candid conversation with you about some of the questions that I get from artists and share stories about artists and bands that we've helped sort of check through those varying questions in different ways, because I know that there's a ton of them. I know that like these questions have been answered, and so I really wanted to highlight that on the show here, hopefully to give our listeners the opportunity to hear these stories and then think about the marketing processes or the campaigns or the systems that we've helped artists build and think about how you can build them for yourself.
Yeah, totally, man. I'm excited to crack into it. Yeah, can't wait to get started.
Cool, yeah. Well, let's kick it off, man.
Yeah, let's do it.
A question that I know a lot of artists struggle with when it comes to marketing their music and marketing themselves online. Immediately, like one of the big like monsters in the closet that comes out is like, can I be my authentic self? Can I fit to my brand that I've been trying to build? Can I market my music successfully when I'm trying to be authentic? Like, what if I look cringe? What happens? How do I do that? And a lot of times what I see out there in the world is like the exact opposite of who I am and what I want to be and how I want to put my music out to the world. And I know we've had tons of examples of this inside of IndieFounder, but is there any specific case that you could highlight that might be a good one to sort of inspire artists to like take their marketing, by the horns and ride with it?
Yeah, I think, just to touch on first, like a helpful point to make with it is I think that a lot of times with musicians, and again, I always say this in consults with people when we're talking about this, is like, I don't know very many musicians that got into music to be marketers. I know a lot of musicians that got into music to be musicians and be artists and be in bands. And so I think a lot of times, when we talk about being your authentic self and how that plays into marketing, to your point, people get scared or confused, and kind of to your point, it's like, am I going to be cringe? Is this going to be my authentic self? So to the question, I always tell people, I think that a lot of times the things that people may think are, they have to put on a front or be someone that they're not is totally the opposite of what they should do. Because really, to be creative and take full advantage of your marketing is like, you should lean into if you have a niche brand or you are a niche artist, because a lot of times that's going to resonate more with people that are in your audience and in your demographic, and that's really going to shine through. And so I always tell people when I get on consults and they say, oh, I'm this niche jazz or prog artist or whatever the case may be, I don't think I can really market that, or I don't think people are going to be receptive to it. And I really try to encourage them to lean into that, because I actually think the thing that they view as a limitation is probably an asset. So yeah, to your question, we're putting some names out here in the podcast today and just using first names for the sake of keeping those artists anonymous. But Cole is a founder student that has worked with Jesse for a long time. And I think he's a great example of that. He's a rock artist with a pretty niche brand. He's got this kind of rock opera that he did and this really cool style and visual element to his brand. And that's something that he really has leaned into in his marketing, and it has had great success from that just by really putting that out there. And from what I can see, really just being his authentic self,
Yeah, I love that. What specifically did he lean into when he was trying to hit his goals as far as like growing his audience? What about his brand and his authentic self did he lean into? Like, what did we help him do?
Yeah, well, from my chats with Jesse about Cole, again, he had a lot of great stuff for a base in terms of being able to kind of launch a career and have a career in music for a long time. But the big hurdle for him was like selling stuff. Like he just hadn't really monetized to a point where maybe he would want, and especially not through ads. And again, he had this rock opera that he had put together, this really cool video that they ended up selling as a DVD. And so essentially, the main lever for them to pull was a sales campaign. And I think off of that, again, he was really able to reach a lot of people that resonated with that brand and with that niche style, and really create a pretty solid customer base from leaning into this like cool rock opera DVD. And then I'm pretty sure on the back of that, he sold some vinyl. And so really kind of leaning into that again, kind of even selling a DVD, it's like you might think, I don't know, is that gonna work, DVD in 2025? But if you find the right audience and you put yourself out there in the right way in that niche or that style, I think it just goes to show that it will really resonate with people.
Well, that's a really good point too, especially about selling specifically, is like when you have something that makes you unique, a niche or a brand or whatever it is that you feel makes you special and authentic, and the thing that you want to be and put yourself out to the world with. When it comes to selling, like that's actually such a positive thing, because it will distract or it will push away the people that aren't the right audience, and it will attract the ones that are. If you're like Cole and you're like a super creative rock artist with like a rock opera kind of angle going on, or if you're a jazz artist that has like a storytelling angle or whatever, it could be anything. If you're like a conscious hip hop artist or something like that, it could go across the board, like so many different subgenres and things like that. All of that I think is really such an asset, especially when it comes to selling, because the people that are going to be most aligned with who you are as an artist are probably also going to be the ones to be like, yeah, I want to support this thing. I want to buy it. I want to have it. I want to have it in my hands.
Yeah. And also, you know, I mean, we talk obviously a lot about Meta. And for those that don't know, and, you know, Meta is the platform that we advertise the most on at Entrepreneur for our clients and students. I think Meta's ability and algorithm to be able to go and really find those people and exclude the people that maybe aren't a good fit for that stuff is really powerful. And again, just to really hammer it home, it's like leaning into that stuff is an asset if you can just be creative and have a cool way of doing it and be yourself and put yourself out there, you know?
Dude, yeah, that's a great story for sure. I mean, like tapping into that when it comes to selling is so important, I think. And I mean, it applies across the board when it comes to music marketing, but if that's not encouraging when it comes to, you know, the question of authenticity in marketing, like if you can get customers and then repeat customers, like that's amazing. That builds you a base for a successful music business.
Yeah.
Which leads me to like the kind of the next question that I think a lot of artists ask me, especially like growing artists, right? Is, okay, I've got some fans. I've got some stuff happening for me. This comes in all shapes and sizes. Maybe you've got fans just from years of touring. Maybe you've got fans from viral moments. Maybe you've got fans from opening up for a bigger artist or being on a TV show or something like that. It could come from anything, but you've got fans, but I don't really know how to engage with them beyond like what I'm doing on social media. I don't really know what the back end of any of that should look like. I don't really know what it means to do the whole music marketing, digital marketing thing.
Yeah, man. Again, in the consults and in talking to people in IndieFounder, I think that is probably like if you're in that position where you don't have an established career and you have fans, but you don't know what to do or you don't know how to connect the dots. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that I think artists run into. You know, it's one thing to acquire the fan base in the first place, but then it's like, let's say to your point, you know, you have that viral moment or you go on tour and you open for that big band and you really do kind of create that fan base. You know, you don't want that to just be a passing moment. You don't want that to just happen and then it kind of life rolls on. And so, I think that's where a big part of what we teach and recommend at Entrepreneur, which is really kind of nurturing those relationships with your fans and really establishing them. And I think especially, you know, to your question is like leaning on digital marketing, leaning on anything you can do to make it a little easier on yourself with, you know, email automation, you know, setting up things in your CRM to be able to create those relationships and really establish them, because it's like once you get buy-in from those fans, that's a really great opportunity that you don't want to let slip away, you know, just because you don't have the systems in place to be able to reach them and nurture those people, you know? Yeah,
for sure. You were telling me about a founder client, Troy, who that was really kind of like his big hurdle to overcome, was like, I've got these fans, I need to do something with them, but I feel like I need a whole overhaul of my infrastructure. We use that word a lot internally at Entrepreneur and probably throw it around on the podcast too. But like for anyone scratching their head and being like, what the hell are they talking about when they talk about marketing infrastructure? Like, what does that mean? What does it look like to overhaul infrastructure? And like, what does that do for someone?
Yeah, definitely with Troy, and shout out Troy. He probably knows who that is. I know he's a big listener of the podcast. I worked with Troy for a long time in IndieFounder, and then he started working more recently with Andy. And I think talking about infrastructure, a lot of times I'll refer to it on consults as like scaffolding. Yeah, it sounds
plumbing.
Plumbing. It sounds complicated, I think, or could be really challenging. But I think one of the beautiful things about that and what we can do with technology and automation is like realistically, it's probably one of the simplest things to really set up, because a lot of it is set it and forget it, or at least like set it and maybe come back to it later and make some revisions. But I mean, to your point in terms of what that is, you know, I think first and foremost is being able to educate fans that are coming in. So if you get someone to sign up for your email list, let's say you play a big show and, you know, you get 100 people to come onto your email list, what's the first touch point look like? You know, is that automated to where you can bring them into your world, tell them a cool story, give them something cool that they might not expect, or share something special with them, and then really have systems in place to continue to nurture that relationship. So maybe there's a second touch point where you're following up. Maybe there's a third touch point where you're presenting an offer or something like that. And the beautiful thing is all of that can be built and set in Drip or MailChimp or the Indie CRM, anything that you're using. And you don't have to, it's not like you have to manually email everybody every time someone comes in. And so, yeah, when we talk about plumbing and infrastructure, that's what a lot of that stuff really entails. And I think for Troy, that was a big part of it, is like he had fans. He's had a lot of success playing shows, especially recently. So it really becomes about, okay, how do I hold on to those relationships and maintain them once the show is over or the video is not getting views anymore or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And I know like with him specifically, we even went so far as to like rebuild infrastructure around how tickets were even being sold, which is like a whole separate part of, building the plumbing or the scaffolding, as you called it.
Yeah, totally. I know him and Andy, dove really deep on that stuff to be able to have good systems in place, because he was selling a lot of tickets independently, for shows. And it's like, you want to be able to track that, you want to be able to catalog that stuff and be in touch with those people. And that's a huge part of it that I think really creates a lot of power. It's like, if you think about it, it's like everyone loves going to a show and having that connection with an artist. And so it's only natural to assume and expect that it would be helpful to continue that relationship once the lights go down and the show's over,
So when you talk to artists, specifically when you're like consulting before someone might work with us in IndieFounder, like how often would you recommend an artist look at their infrastructure, or maybe they're looking at it for the first time?
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are maybe wondering like, okay, I've got some stuff in place, but how do I know what to even look at when it comes to like, would I need an overhaul? Am I missing the places where I might engage my fans?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I think most of the time, and this isn't everybody, but like more often than not, it's that people just lack it and not that it needs an overhaul. So like, it's less of a refactoring and more of a just building, because again, even though I think it's something that is pretty easy realistically to actually set up, it's not particularly complex in any way. It's just a little bit of effort to get that stuff going. It's something that's really easy to overlook. I actually did a consult today with someone that was exactly in that position where it sounded to me like they were doing so much boots on the ground work to really grow their career, but just were missing some really simple back end things. And they're like, man, like I feel like I'm working so hard and I'm just stuck on this treadmill and I'm just running in place. And it's like, yeah, well, you're lacking kind of these really simple systems that you need to put in place. So yeah, a lot of times, and if you are an artist that has some of that stuff, like maybe looking at refactoring, figuring out how you might improve that stuff. But I think a lot of times it's just generally that people just lack it and don't have it in the first place. And that's really where I think we can come in with training, whether you do Indie Pro or IndieFounder. We have a ton of stuff that talks about how to get that stuff going. And I think that it's really powerful, especially whether you're just starting out or whether you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of fans, it can help any artist.
And that's a really good point because it goes beyond engagement, right? Like engaging the fans, that answers the question of like, I've got fans and I need to figure out what it looks like to engage them next. But that data ownership is so critical as you're starting to grow. And I think that's a lot of what the infrastructure work also lets you do as well. You mentioned like going out on the road and wanting to own the touch points that you have with your fans before, during, and after the fact. Well, not only will you get to have that kind of engagement by building systems like those, but you'll be able to track that engagement. You'll be able to know what's happening with those fans, or that something is happening at all, which is what so many artists miss out on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's tragic in a lot of ways because, again, I think a lot of artists have that maybe viral moment or a really good line for their career, and many are ill-prepared to capitalize on it. And I think it's a shame because even back in 2018, when we were, running fan finders all the time, right? That's a great example where it's like, you'd run, I did that as Dukes, I ran a fan finder and had all these views and tons of attention on the videos I was putting out, and it was like, now what? Then what? And it's really a shame if you're not in a position to capitalize on it. And that's why too, I mean, I tell people, and I kind of say this a little bit joking, but also serious, when people ask me on consults, well, what, when's a good time to join IndieFounder? When should I sign up? And I kind of jokingly say, I think the best time to join IndieFounder was yesterday. And I kind of mean that, because I think in a lot of ways, there's always things that you can work on. And if you're missing some of these critical systems, you might be sitting on more success and more gold, so to speak, than you're even aware, because you're just not digging in the right areas to kind of find it, to stretch out that metaphor.
For sure. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. That totally makes sense. And I couldn't agree more. There's one other question that I wanted to cover for this episode, which was like, if you're an artist that has a lot of music and a strong brand built up, and you do have some infrastructure in place, but you're just wondering, like, how do I make revenue a priority for myself? That's something that a lot of artists want to know about, is like, how do I make marketing that actually at least has a chance of paying for itself, like has the opportunity to make some money back. Usually through merch sales is what people are curious about, or selling their records. I'd love to dive into that with you a little bit from the standpoint of what you've seen with clients at IndieFounder and what we've done with some of them.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a great question and a great example where it's like, I think a lot of times as independent artists, we're taught, just like put up a merch store and like people are going to buy your merch. And it's like, it's not that simple. I think that obviously a good first step, and always a first step, is like you need to have stuff to sell, right? Because again, I think people talk about ads and I'm not seeing a return on these ads. And it's like, well, you don't have anything to sell. So, I mean, where are you expecting to see that return on investment? So if you find your stuff in that place, and, something we were talking about, an artist that we work with, an IndieFounder, her name is Raquel, also, I think a big listener of the podcast. She was a great example of someone that did have a lot of music, a great brand, lots of fans, and honestly had merch to sell as well. But the big challenge was she didn't have a way to connect the two. So in other words, she had CDs, vinyl, shirts, hats, whatever the case may be, and knew that revenue was a priority in terms of wanting to really prioritize that, but she didn't really have systems in place to do that. She didn't really have a storefront. I think Bandcamp is what she was using prior to IndieFounder. Someone that's in that kind of position where you have merch and you have fans and you've kind of started to really build that stuff out, making sure that you really have strong systems to be able to sell that merch is super important. So like step one, obviously, is the point of sale, having a Shopify store or Squarespace e-commerce or whatever you're doing. And then I think leveraging ads and digital marketing to put that stuff in front of people. And that's where we start talking about free plus shipping and handling that, we've talked about a ton on the podcast, doing things like pre-orders for your new record, different things like that can really help kind of connect the dots from, I have this brand, I have these fans, and I have this merch. And it's kind of about marrying the two and being able to point people in that direction,
That's a good point. It's those simple kind of like sales systems. You said that well, like connect the dots between the fan base, the merch, and what you have or could have on the back end in terms of like a store. If you've got the merch, you need a store to sell it in and to sell it well. And you need funnels or offers that are put in front of those fans so that you can actually make the sales that pay for the marketing or pay back the marketing.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I mean, it sounds simple, but I personally am often surprised how little people do that. It's like a lot of artists just think, well, I have a merch store and it's just as simple as that. It's just no one's buying my merch. And it's like, well, there's probably a reason for that, and they might be unaware, or they might not even know that you have it, or, that you didn't link to your store on your website or in your emails, and it's sometimes as simple as that. And then other times maybe a little more complex to where, like in Raquel's case, I think she had a pretty sizable fan base and a pretty big warm audience that she had built out from just, a lot of good work over the years. It was more just a matter of really presenting that stuff in a meaningful way. And again, ads are a great way to do that. It's like, it's already an artist that maybe people recognize or know or familiar with. So it's like, you throw up some good ads around that stuff, it's going to work. You've already built up a lot of that goodwill and recognition in the market for people to come in and want to scoop up your stuff.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, and just to loop back to what you talked about at the beginning of the episode when we were just starting to kick off talking about all of this, was like, in a lot of cases, you have a base of some kind, right? And it's then about building the systems and the marketing to connect to that base or build upon that base. You've got a foundation, right? And then it's really just about putting the right offers in front of your fans at the right time and driving them to the place where they need to go. And it reminds me of a question one time that I was asked about, like, well, can't I just run some ads to my store that's just out there, like ads for anything in my store? And it's like, well, no, like you probably shouldn't do that. You probably should be thoughtful and creative about one offer that you're putting in front of your fans and giving the best chance of a fan taking action on one thing. And I think Raquel's example here is a good one of doing just that, building the store, then building an offer and running ads around it, and then building a follow-up offer to that with the pre-order campaigns for a record. That's a really, really good example.
Yeah, and like when we talk about, I think we did an episode on this a couple years ago, but like, same thing for me, and similar to honestly what Raquel had done, which is like, fish as an introductory offer, free plus shipping and handling, establish contact with that fan, sell them something, maybe you upsell them, and then it's like having that pre-order on the back end as a follow-up offer, and I think, again, leveraging ads and infrastructure, to do all that. And I think an important point to make too, even in this example, we're talking about an artist that did have a lot of fans and a lot of, again, kind of goodwill built up in the market. But this is why I tell people, to go back to what I said, it's like the best time to join IndieFounder is yesterday, because even if you're in a position where you don't feel like you have that, and even if you don't have products to sell yet, learning these systems and getting these things in place and having an understanding of it, whether you do that now or 3 years from now when you have more of that stuff, is going to be really important. And it's like, it's a skill. It takes time. And to your point, honing those offers and having the right offer in your ads, it's just like anything else. It's like when we were learning an instrument, you weren't a badass guitar player on day one. It took time to learn that. And so it's like adapting to these systems and learning there's something you need for your business is a good decision to make as early as possible, whether you have all that stuff or not,
100% for sure.
Yeah.
That's a really great analogy. We'll leave off with that for today. I've got a ton more questions that we're going to be bringing back to Jonah next time on the podcast. More questions from artists like yourselves that hopefully will inspire and give you some insight into the types of marketing campaigns that you can build. So we'll catch you guys next time on Creative Juice. Me and Jonah will be back then. Peace.
Can y'all really feel us? East Coast.